Here is the problem. What selects genes for expression?
What do you mean?
I mean, after all this time, we still don't understand development or function. Why do our stem cells grow us ears or eyes in just the right spot and not just grow a bunch of noses or a pile of cells that are neither? When something goes wrong with differentiation, we call it cancer. And when something goes right with differentiation, we call it an organism. But we don't know the basic rules that make it happen. We don't understand why cells do what they do and become what they become. And this means we don't understand biology because all life is made up of cells.
But you're wrong. We understand so much. We have so many medicines, so many treatments, and now we know so much about genes. Genes cause everything.
Genes certainly don't cause everything. They're essential ingredients in almost everything. But their role is clearly misunderstood by our paradigm of science. Their role is as instruments, not as guides.
I'm sorry, that sounds ridiculous.
I'd even go further. The same incomprehension applies also to nearly every drug we use in modern medicine. This is why we need so many randomized trials with thousands of subjects in order to do anything, because we don't know the fundamental rules of biology. We introduce a change to one gene or one protein or one small molecule at a time, and then we guess about its effect on the patient. That's no way to manage health. That's like changing one fuse at a time in the wiring harness that steers an airplane before takeoff, and then having to test thousands of airplanes before you can predict where it will land. If we knew how the system really worked, we could steer the airplane right where we wanted it to go. We could heal congested hearts, regrow limbs, remake demented brains. We could actually control biology.
Well, that's a nice fantasy, okay, but you're missing the obvious limitations we face. We're controlled by our genes, and they had to evolve over eons to get into just the right combinations to make us functional. But we're making good strides understanding the patterns of gene networks.
Well, gene networks, that's not a bad thing to know, but it's really not the main point. It's like a drunk looking for his lost keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is. The real mystery is not in genetics. Genes are necessary, but nothing is controlled by genes. That's just a philosophical mistake. Function is controlled entirely by something else, something we are not studying very hard. And that something uses genes as tools to do its job. It's a process we haven't imagined very well. I named it epistolution because it's so unexamined that it doesn't even have a name.
With all due respect, that sounds like total craziness. Sorry.
Okay, well, let me show you what I mean. The idea that genes control function is mathematically impossible. There are roughly 25,000 genes that code for proteins in the human genome. Now, the number of unique ways these genes could be selected for expression is something like 10 to the 17,000th power. Just for reference, the number of atoms in the observable universe is something like 10 to the 80th power. So there are an almost infinite number of gene expression patterns that would be incompatible with life. But the cell usually selects just the right ones. So again, I ask you, what selects just the right genes for expression?
That's easy. Listen carefully. Genes are turned on and off by other genes. It's called a gene regulatory network. It works because it has evolved through natural selection to work exactly right over literally billions of years.
That's a neat idea. And it's true that genes turn one another on and off. But every time that happens, there's another cause at work that controls function. The genome doesn't control itself. Two common sense thought experiments will prove to you that I'm right. First, if you put a DNA strand alone in a petri dish without a cell, will it come to life?
Of course not. It requires a cell.
Or the reverse? But yes, DNA doesn't activate itself. It needs to be acted upon by another entity.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it does.
Okay, second thought experiment. We have a zygote, which is a pluripotent stem cell. Then it begins dividing, and the cells differentiate into various cell types, neurons and muscles and bones, and they start doing things. Is the genetic sequence the same or different after differentiation?
The underlying sequence is the same. It was the epigenetic markings that changed.
Okay, were the markings specifically controlled by the genome?
Well, no, like I said, the underlying sequence is the same. The stimulus directing the markings was acquired from the cells placed in the group of other cells. That's how an embryo forms.
Okay, then something outside the cell, namely its stimulus from other cells, is responsible for its acquiring certain functions.
Okay, yeah, if you want to describe it that way.
And do we know the rules or codes that this stimulus applies to the cell? Do we know what it is about the cell's place and location that makes it turn into, say, a cardiac cell rather than a skin cell?
Well, no, we don't know much of anything about that. It's so highly specific. It's hard to study and very time dependent. It's a really challenging process to work out through experiment.
Okay, I'll grant you that. But I think I will be able to show you that it is, in fact, something very simple. There's a process that's common to all cells that controls the fate of each cell.
Okay, whatever. In any case, the example you're shown is reminding me of one thing that is correct. There's a process that results in the acquisition of function that is not guided by random mutations to gene sequence or by natural selection. Differentiation is not guided by either of those.
Thank you.
But I have to tell you, this whole idea is nonsense, and I'm going to tell you why. You ready? The influences that govern function have to be inherited in a highly specific structure that doesn't vary except in rare cases. It simply is necessary that a highly complex process has highly complex instructions, and the only way complexity can have accumulated in nature is by natural selection gradually deleting non-functional structures and preserving functional ones. That's why the instructions for function have to be in the genome. If they were in the environment, they would not be heritable and would not show descent with modification. The whole conceptual edifice of evolutionary biology requires that there be specific units that can be mathematically analyzed to show how evolution could have developed the amazing structures and functions that we see all over nature. Without that, explaining the evolution of complexity requires a supernatural guiding force, like a god.
Okay, you're wrong, but seeing why you're wrong requires a lot of imagination. This is why epistolution requires a true paradigm shift. It's a redefinition of what an organism is. All the conceptual edifice you refer to, the modern synthesis, analysis of genes and their effects, it's true, but it's highly incomplete. It all presupposes self organization without explaining it. Genes do indeed evolve by the rules discovered by computational evolutionary biology. But these rules just don't explain how an organism works. It presupposes the organism working. And it's because an organism isn't a gene directed thing, it's a gene controller. Like Barbara McClintock said, a genome is a sensitive organ of the cell. An organism is a process that controls genes, that uses genes to do its work. The basic process that controls the organism is a very specific, highly regulated cycle of feedback that it engages with its environment. Well, not exactly its environment, really. It's Umwelt.
Are you seriously speaking German to me right now? Can you please explain to me what you mean by Umwelt?
Yes, but this is going to be a little trippy. Are you ready?
Okay. This whole conversation honestly has been a little trippy, but go ahead.
Okay. When I say the word environment, when I talk about our environment, for example, you think I mean something that's common to us both, right? Like if I'm in a room and you're in a room, we're in the same environment, right?
Yes, I'd say that's true. Yep.
Okay, not the case with Umwelt. Umwelt refers to the set of interactions I'm having with my environment. Okay. So if we are in your living room, for example, I'm liable to be less comfortable than you because I hate the heat and you hate the cold and it's warm in there. So you sit at the table while I'm on the sofa. And while we're sitting, I'm thinking about how it reminds me of my fourth grade classroom while you're thinking about how it reminds you of how you need to vacuum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the interactions we're having are totally different.
Got it. I think I see. So what you're saying is that the environment is kind of an abstraction, if you will, a platonic ideal that we create in language to refer to what's common between us objectively, but really there is nothing common between our subjective experiences. I'm familiar with this. Yeah, I can acknowledge that in terms of interactions with our surroundings, we actually live in totally separate subjective worlds. I got
Yes, exactly. We have to escape from Plato in this Platonic dialogue.
it. But just as a sidebar here, when I use language, I really can only touch those abstractions of shared reality. Words only refer to the imaginary common values between our subjective worlds. Otherwise, we couldn't communicate.
It is worth bearing that in mind.
So, what you're saying, I think, is that two cells in the same tissue are not in the same environment. They're expressing different proteins and acting slightly different because they're in different umwelts. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
They're engaged in different patterns of interaction.
That's right. Umwelt is a word coined by Jacob von Uexküll that means the world unto an organism.
Okay. So what you're saying is that we have to understand the rules of interaction of every cell with every umwelt if we want to really understand biology.
Yes, exactly. But it's not going to be as hard as you think.
Why on earth is that? I mean, it sounds like you're saying we have to have detailed molecular knowledge of every single interaction in this cell is undergoing in order to make any predictions at all. How is that not going to be hard? Come on.
Well, that's true if you want to understand in detail only that particular cell. But of course, what we care about is the function of a whole organism with trillions of cells, or even the whole community of organisms. And for that, we have to zoom way out. We have to zoom out to look at what life really is fundamentally. We have to understand how life can be controlling genes through epistolution. Life all has the same molecular tools, DNA, and so it must all have the same general way of controlling those tools.
But why is that?
Well, because the DNA that works in one organism also works in another. Fish genes work just fine in soybeans, for example. And we have bacterial genes in our own genome and viral genes too. DNA is universal. So its controlling mechanism should be universal.
So I guess now's the time you're going to tell me about epistolution. What are you talking about?
Okay. I thought you'd never ask. So the idea here is that each cell has an intelligence of its own. Each cell develops knowledge. Epistolution is a word combining epistemology and evolution. So we have to explain how knowledge gets into cells in a fundamental way. Of course, I don't mean consciousness. This is not a theory of consciousness at all because I don't know anything about consciousness. But a cell is a thing that we have never imagined yet. It's not a machine like anything we're familiar with. It's a machine with heritable parts that's completely guided by its umwelt, not by its heritable parts.
That's some pretty language, but I'm a scientist. So, I mean, how is that actually going to work?
Okay. Well, we have to look really hard at plasticity. That's the set of responses that an organism or a cell has to its umwelt. We have to start to try to imagine general rules of interaction that might apply to every cell in every living being on Earth.
Like what, for example, pray tell?
Well, interactions that are common, ways of interacting with umwelts that are common to every cell on Earth. So there's several mysteries that are very pertinent here. We have to generalize about how organisms differ from machines. Plasticity follows some general guidelines, but they're really vague. Like organisms tend to benefit from exercise, for example, which is something no machine benefits from. They tend to do better if they're damaged in a certain way, in other words, and then allowed to recover. The more complex and cognitive an organism is, the more likely it is to benefit from lots of sleep, which is some sort of mandatory repair process. Machines never sleep. And organisms also seem to have a will to senesce, at least their cells do. That means aging, biological aging. That's hard to explain. We don't want to die, but our cells want to die, it seems. And we're made of cells. So we get old and then we fail. And it's hard to see how that benefits our survival and reproduction from a selfish gene standpoint.
Okay. So with this argument, are you trying to say that life is not only guided by evolutionary incentives towards survival and reproduction? Because if you are saying that, then I think you're going to have an extremely heavy lift because, like it or not, that's maybe the most basic premise of biology.
Yes, actually, I am saying that. So think
Okay.
about it. There's no way that differentiation is guided by an incentive to survive and reproduce, because that would require the individual cells to have foresight about the fate of the entire organism. And there's also no way it's guided by heritable material like DNA for the reasons we just went over. The DNA doesn't change during differentiation. Therefore, what cells do and what they become is guided by their interaction with the Umwelt. The only coherent way to describe this is that they're guided by learning. Because of what they are incentivized to gain knowledge. Cells want to learn. They want to incorporate knowledge into their structures. That's what guides them. Being is for knowing. Of course, it's compatible with survival and reproduction. Otherwise, they wouldn't still be here. I mean, the definition of an organism is something that has survived and reproduced, right? But there's another incentive, knowledge.
Okay. So what's your definition of knowledge then?
Well, the answer here is really simple, but hard to grasp. Knowledge is causal inference. It has nothing to do with information. As a culture, we have been thinking of knowledge as the information we can gain that helps us accomplish tasks. But this presupposes that we know what task to accomplish. And life is not about that. It's about discovering what tasks we should accomplish. A cell is a machine not for accomplishing predetermined tasks, but for finding what tasks it should be focusing on given its Umwelt.
So what is information then?
Information is distinct from knowledge, at least the way I use the word. Information is sets of templates. DNA is information, and so are symbols and language. They are both templates for knowledge. They have no meaning outside the knowledge that we bring to them. Claude Shannon wrote that information is a message selected from a set of possible messages. That's a good definition. It's a mathematical definition. Information is about encoding and decoding knowledge so it can be transferred from one place to another.
Okay, I can see that, and I've heard that before, but I'm sorry, I still don't understand what you mean by knowledge.
Knowledge is a set of causal inferences about an Umwelt. It's a guess about the world. What wiggles what? Look, deep down, I think what you need to understand here is that we organisms live in a world of causation. We experience causation. We care about causation. We encode causation in our symbols to tell stories. And we encode causation into our neural patterns and even into our somatic cells. That's what understanding is. The machines we have today, like computers, are not causal machines. They're built from mathematics. Mathematics is a world free of causation. This is a fundamental confusion of our whole age and our culture. Knowledge is about discovering true patterns of causation in our physical world, discovering explanations. We have to do that by physical interaction, by hypothesis testing. We cannot do it by math alone. Math is a tool that helps us, but all the expressions in mathematics are true by definition. They're tautologies. There's no hypothesis present in a pure equation. It must be applied to the world to become a hypothesis. Math is all one big tautology, and it understands nothing about the world on its own. It contains no knowledge. An equation is true whether you read it left or right, or reverse the terms and read it the other direction, left to right or right to left. It doesn't matter. There's an equal sign in the middle. A causal pattern is not like that. A causal pattern is only true in one direction. It's composed of arrows, not equations. An organism is a machine for absorbing causal patterns from its umwelt. This is really simple, but really hard to grasp. I call it incumulation. Organisms incumulate causal inferences from their worlds. The philosopher Karl Popper determined that knowledge was always built by conjecture and refutation. That's the best theory of knowledge that we have today. But the mystery has always been, where do conjectures come from?
Okay, this is beginning to make a little more sense. What you're saying, I think, is that every little cell is a learner, and its thirst for learning is what determines how it acts and what it becomes. A little bit like kindergartners.
Exactly, like kindergartners. They interact with the world based on what they already know in a way that is driven by their thirst to incorporate new knowledge. They try things, and if they don't work, they invent new ideas.
But you're not saying that cells are intentional, that they have awareness, are you?
Yes, I am. Again, I don't have a theory of consciousness, but yes, they are aware in the sense that they are trying to find the right solutions to the problems they're faced with. These problems come from a conflict between their knowledge and the experience they're having, just like our problems as adult humans.
Okay, this is all very weird, I have to tell you, but I'm seeing how it makes some sense for you. But tell me more about the process of this epistolution. I mean, how would it actually work? And why is it compatible with evolutionary theory, which it seems like you just tried to refute earlier in our conversation, but I just really don't understand that part. Can you help?
Yeah. Epistolution is a cycle of damage and repair that distinguishes between use and disuse. Biologists from the beginning of modern biology in the 18th century always assumed that organisms were shaped by use and disuse. It took an incredibly harsh philosophical turn to deny that fact in the 20th century. Darwin mentioned use and disuse several times in The Origin of Species. It's obvious that use and disuse influence the development of all organs, including especially the brain. If I practice carpentry, I become a carpenter. If I sing, I get better at singing. It's so obvious that it takes a lot of education to learn not to see that.
Okay, I agree that these developmental changes are poorly understood. And I agree that they're not mediated by the genome because the genome doesn't change during our lifetime, right? But that is not exactly the entire point and why this line of thinking is so wrongheaded. Evolution cannot have created this type of process because there's no inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarckism doesn't happen. The carpenter's children aren't born with stronger arms. They're born with dispositions to develop certain phenotypes based on their genotypes. Come on.
Right. But that doesn't tell us how their genotypes came to be the way they are. Okay, watch this move carefully. I'm going to show you that plasticity can drive genetic evolution in a way that looks exactly like the fixation of random mutations, but is in fact non-random. In other words, I'm going to prove to you that learned behaviors and acquired characteristics can become encoded in the genome over generations.
You you cannot do that. That is totally prohibited. At least you can't do that without invoking God, like I said earlier.
I'm going to do it. Just watch. Okay, we have a gazelle. Are you with me?
All right.
Okay, the gazelle has some plasticity and some capacity for learning. Let's say he can learn what bushes to eat. Okay, the gazelle learns over his experience that the new invasive acacia bushes that just arrived on his island are the most nutritious bushes, and he begins to alter his behavior accordingly. He begins to hang out near the acacias. He also uses his muscles in new ways because the acacias are taller than his usual forage. His rear leg muscles get stronger to hold him up while he's grazing these taller bushes. Now he has two adaptations. okay, both driven by epigenetic markings, the learned behavior of eating the acacias, and the acquired characteristics of strong leg muscles. Okay, are either of these changes random with respect to function?
No, I'll admit those are adaptive changes that seem targeted to keep the gazelle alive. They're non-random, but they are also not heritable. So when conditions change, they're going to disappear.
Right. Okay, pay attention carefully. If conditions change, the gazelle might want to lose those characteristics. Okay, but now think about what happens if instead the conditions stay the same for a long time. If conditions stay the same and the genotype of the gazelle stays the same, they will continue acquiring the same epigenetic markings generation after generation, right? And they will keep eating the acacias. Now think about what that means for traditional gene evolution. It means that random mutations that support an acacia eating lifestyle are favored by selection pressure, and random mutations that are harmful in that lifestyle are weeded out by natural selection. So, over many generations, the new acacia eating lifestyle that began as an acquired characteristic has become a fully genetically fixed trait. So, the strong leg muscles and the knowledge of the acacias fits into a lifestyle that now is become completely encoded in the genome. That's called genetic assimilation. It was discovered by Conrad Waddington in the 1950s, but not many people have realized how it presents us with a way to resolve the paradox of Lamarckian evolution.
So what you're saying is that adaptive plasticity can direct genetic evolution.
Yes, exactly. And there's nothing mysterious about it. These are well-established mechanisms.
And you're saying that in order to establish Lamarckian evolution, we don't have to show transgenerational epigenetic inheritance at all. We just have to show that the same marks are made over and over if conditions do not change, and that normal genetic evolution is occurring meanwhile.
Yes, exactly.
So genes really could be followers in many cases instead of leaders. And this would explain why development is not controlled by genetic sequences, because random mutation of genes doesn't necessarily cause all evolutionary changes. It's the way the organism responds to its Umwelt that creates the selection pressures that eventually shape the genome.
Right, exactly. The genome is a sort of memory. The genome is an organ that inherits memories of functional solutions that were discovered during the ongoing process of epistolution that the ancestors engaged in. Cells can't control the actual nucleotides that turn up in the genome, but they can control function nevertheless. And function determines selection pressure, which controls which gene sequences pass through the gauntlet of natural selection, because they are selecting which genes to use and when. Genes are like the keys on a piano. If you change the keys, the song will change. But the keys don't tell the piano player what notes to play. And in this case, epistolution is the piano player.
Okay, give me a second to think about that. I like that metaphor, but walk me through that one more time. What is epistolution?
Epistolution is the process by which organisms change according to use and disuse. To see it, you have to imagine that an organism is something that can be divided into used parts and disused parts. If you think of them as parts, though, it makes no sense. I mean, what is used and what is disused? Cells, organs, tissues, they're all used. It makes no sense. Everything is used in different ways.
Right. I don't get it.
Well, instead of thinking of an organism as parts, think of it as processes. Think of it as oscillations.
Oscillations, what are you talking about?
An organism is a set of chemical reactions, right?
Right.
Okay. And they all tend to repeat on a schedule, right? Heartbeats, breaths, body temperature fluctuations, bowel movements, sleep, wake patterns, menstruation, etc. All the processes of life are repetitive. They're like clockwork. And there's a master clock in the brain in the suprachiasmatic nucleus that controls the master circadian rhythm and governs many of the functions, the timing of the functions, right?
Okay, right. So you're basically arguing that an organism is just a chemical process that's a big pile of oscillations. So oscillations are the units of use and disuse. That makes some sense. It makes sense of addiction, for instance. Cravings get stronger when used, etc. So some of the oscillations are used, some are disused, and during waking, this damage is uneven. Then when these uneven damages are repaired during sleep, this is what drives epistolution. This is what accommodates us to our Umwelts in a functional way. Use and disuse is all Lamarckian. Are you also saying that randomness enters the structure of the organism by way of the disused parts? So if an oscillation is disused, it degrades randomly. But if it's used, it gets repaired and strengthened?
Yes, that is what I'm saying. That's where conjecture comes from a random change to some oscillation within the organism that was disused. So new ideas are decayed oscillations. And this whole idea, this whole concept resolves the question of agency. So there are two main theories of life today. One says that an organism is a machine for replicating information, and the other says it is a machine for harvesting free energy. Neither seems to capture agency very well. This one is a third option. If the organism is an attractor for causal knowledge that it derives from the Umwelt, then it explains why it goes where it goes and does what it does, why its will seems free, and why it remains a self. Otherwise, we can't explain why only organisms persist as selves through change. Okay, I'm not doing a good job explaining this part right here. What I'm trying to say is that agency is a matter of framing problems. It's not a matter of solving problems. It's choosing what problems to work on. And that's a matter of what knowledge you have. And what knowledge you have, given your environment, determines the questions, the problems that you work on. So if we use that as a sort of framework, then I think we can begin to understand how organisms work on problems that then, through evolution, help them solve the problems that allow them to persist as selves. Go ahead.
I mean, I think you're talking about self-organization and why they do that, but I mean, that's an unsolved mystery. No one's figured that out.
Right. And nothing makes any sense without solving that mystery. We have to maintain selves before we can undergo Darwinian natural selection. You know, the Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics was supposedly disproven by August Weismann when he showed that amputated mouse tails were not inherited. But that experiment was complete nonsense. An amputation is not a functional change. And one generation is a pretty short trial for evolution anyway. I'm saying that unless plasticity is random with respect to function, acquired characteristics must be directing evolution through genetic assimilation.
Say that again?
The burden of proof is actually on the neo-Darwinists to show that plasticity is random with respect to function. Otherwise, the simplest explanation for evolution is that plasticity creates functional adaptations, and genes are later assimilated that support those lifestyle changes.
Sir, you have an upside down view of everything, but I will admit it could be possible. And I will admit that cells are directed by something external through differentiation. But your leap to calling it knowledge and saying cells are making causal inferences is pretty wild, I have to say. And I'm going to have to sleep on that.
Totally. Me too. Today is Wednesday, September 13th. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.